Hey guys, thanks for checking out this clip of Anatomy of the Church and State. Be sure to catch the full episode on Rumble or ChristiansForLiberty.com. Links are in the show description.
So a lot of people jump right to Romans 13. I mean, what's Paul writing about leading up to this verse?
Yeah, no, that's the key question, and we won't go there. But first off, Paul uses what I call apostolic logic. In Ephesians, you have 3 chapters of doctrine, generally speaking, and then in chapter 4:1, therefore, and he gets into a lot of practical application. And in Ephesians, after 3 chapters of doctrine, we get into application. And then Paul begins to address spheres. Wives, be subject to your husbands. Children, honor your mother and father. Slaves, be obedient to your masters. So Paul has this logic of let me lay out doctrine. Then after I've laid out the doctrine early in 4, it's love. He calls them to love one another. And then he calls them to be in submission. And then he talks about spheres in which you would be subject. So he does that in Ephesians. Peter does the exact same thing. 1 Peter 1, he talks about, this glorious inheritance that we have. And then he says, be subject to every human institution. And then he starts to name human institutions, whether the king or one sent by the king. And then he talks about husbands and wives. And so there's this apostolic logic of let me lay out doctrine. After I've laid out doctrine, let me call you to respond properly. The first call to respond properly is walk in love. And then love always is going to result in some sort of submission in the spheres in which you find yourself, whether you're a child, whether you're a slave, whether you're a wife, or whether you're just a citizen under a government. There's different spheres in which you have to submit yourself. So when you get to Romans chapter 13, your question was, what is he talking about? Well, it goes back to Romans 12. And if you've, studied Romans, you see that there's 11 chapters of doctrine. And then in 12:1, it's therefore present your bodies a living sacrifice and be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you will approve the will of God. And so that's the transition, just like Ephesians, just like 1 Peter. And then what he calls them to do in section after section of chapter 12 is here's how I want you to live. So, for example, in 12:4, just as we have many members in one body, they don't all have the same function. Christian, I want you to think about how to live with people in your local church. And then he lists some spiritual gifts. And then in verse 9, love without hypocrisy. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. So he's dealing with the church in particular. Then in 12:14, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. We've now moved outside of the church. Now I'm talking to Christians about how to deal with the unbelieving world. So don't curse those who persecute you. You see verse 17 of 12, never paying back evil for evil to anyone, respecting what's good in the sight of all men. And so he's talking about how do we love those around us in the local church, in society at large. And then here's the key. The key is really in verse 19. Never taking your own revenge, beloved. Instead, leave room for the wrath of God, for it's written, vengeance is mine, I will repay. But if your enemy's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink, for in doing so, you'll heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So he has told Christians, if you're dealing with persecution, evil people, unkind people, you are not allowed to take vengeance. Okay, no, it's not been delegated to you.
Right, and vengeance not to be confused with self-defense.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Vengeance is the repaying, and that's what you see there in verse 19 of 12. Vengeance is mine, I will repay. So we're not talking about self-defense. And obviously you have, if you have the right to life, and you do, because you're an image bearer of God, that's why it's wrong to commit suicide. You're not allowed to even take your own life. You're under divine obligation to defend your own life. You're not allowed to just give it to somebody. So
Got it.
This is key though, because in 12:19, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Then when we get to chapter 13, he's still on the same topic. Because if you look, for example, when you get into 13:1, every person be subject to the governing authorities. When you get to verse 4, it's a minister of God to you for good. If you do what's evil, be afraid. It does not bear the sword in vain. It's a minister of God. And then in verse 4, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. That's the same root word from back in 12:19. Who has vengeance been given to? Not you, Christian, not as an individual. God has given the office of vengeance to somebody. It's not you, it's to the civil authorities. So that's the context in Romans 13.